She stood at the altar ready to say yes, but in the crowd she saw him, her first love. In an instant, her whole life changed. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments what you would do. Elizabeth Williams sat in front of the towering mirror of the bridal boutique, her dark, smooth skin glowing under the warm lights. The silk of the wedding dress draped perfectly around her body, the intricate lacework a masterpiece of craftsmanship. The reflection before her should have filled her with joy. It was a designer gown, hand-picked by stylists, the very image of elegance and refinement. But as she gazed at herself, an unsettling hollowness lingered beneath the surface. The boutique was an exclusive one, hidden behind a grand set of double doors in a high-end district of Manhattan, where the air smelled of wealth, subtle perfumes, and quiet prestige. Sales associates moved with rehearsed grace, their hands gliding over fabrics worth more than some people's yearly salaries. Everything was perfect. Everything was curated for the moment Elizabeth was supposed to cherish. But something was missing. She adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist, feeling its weight, its coldness. The ring on her finger, an exquisite piece from the Bancroft collection, designed specifically for her, felt more like a contract than a promise. Michael Bancroft, her fiancé, was the perfect man on paper. Tall, charismatic, wealthy beyond measure, and the sole heir to Bancroft Financial, a firm that dictated the movements of entire economies. His proposal had been grand. A private rooftop dinner overlooking the skyline, a ring placed before her as journalists conveniently captured the perfect shot. It had been the kind of proposal that went viral, that set expectations for love stories in magazines and television dramas. And yet, despite it all, Elizabeth couldn't shake the feeling that she was a supporting character in her own story. The boutique's door opened, and Michael stepped inside, his presence immediately commanding the room. His fitted navy blue suit accentuated the sharp angles of his jawline, his slicked-back blonde hair as impeccable as his reputation. The sales associates practically bowed in reverence. He exuded power, the kind that didn't need to raise its voice to be heard. "How does it feel?" he asked, his lips curving into a practiced smile as he took in the sight of her. Elizabeth swallowed. "It fits." Michael chuckled softly. "I meant the moment. Our wedding, less than a week away." She knew the answer she was supposed to give. She knew the words that would make him happy, that would reaffirm the stability of their arrangement. "It feels surreal," she said instead, choosing a neutral truth. Michael took a step forward, reaching for her hand. His grip was firm, confident, just like everything else about him. "Everything is in place. The guest list, the venue, the media coverage. This will be the event of the year, Elizabeth. You and I, powerful, untouchable, we're making history." She nodded, offering him a soft smile. He didn't see the hesitance in her eyes. Michael wasn't cruel. He wasn't unkind. In fact, he was everything a woman could ask for in a husband if what she sought was security and social elevation. Their relationship was built on strategy, on mutual benefit. But love, passion, the kind of connection that made people abandon reason for something more, it was absent. And yet, she had spent years convincing herself that love was secondary, that stability mattered more. "Vanessa has finalized the floral arrangements," Michael continued, referring to his mother, the ever-watchful matriarch of the Bancroft Empire. "Everything is aligned. All you need to do is walk down the aisle and say I do." Elizabeth's fingers tightened around the lace of her dress. "Right," she murmured. The rehearsal dinner was an extravagant affair held at the private ballroom of an exclusive five-star hotel. The air was thick with the scent of champagne and luxury, crystal chandeliers casting golden hues over pristine white tablecloths. Guests of the highest social standing filled the room. Politicians, CEOs, the elite of New York, all there to celebrate the impending merger of the Bancrofts and the Williamses. Elizabeth sat at the grand table, her place beside Michael feeling less like a seat of honor and more like a role she had been cast into. She listened to the chatter around her, to the effortless discussions of business ventures and investments, the subtle power plays woven into every sentence. Her parents sat a few seats away, their expressions proud, though slightly out of place among the polished aristocracy. They had worked hard for everything they had, fought through the barriers placed before them as a black family striving for success. Her mother had built a career in law, her father in finance, and though they had carved their way into the upper class, they were still viewed as newcomers in a world where old money reigned supreme. She wondered if they noticed how different this world was, if they realized that, despite her place at this table, she would always be seen as an exception rather than a norm. Michael leaned in, his voice low enough for only her to hear. "Are you all right?" Elizabeth forced a small nod, just taking it all in. He smiled, pleased with her answer, before returning his attention to the conversation about a billion-dollar investment deal. She exhaled softly, taking a sip of her wine, willing the evening to pass uneventfully. Then the microphone crackled, and the voice of the MC echoed through the ballroom. "And now, please welcome the maid of honor, Amelia Harris." Elizabeth's breath caught. A round of applause filled the room as Amelia, her best friend from college, stepped onto the small stage. Tall, poised, radiant in a midnight blue gown, Amelia commanded attention effortlessly. But Elizabeth wasn't looking at Amelia. She was staring at the man standing just behind her. Daniel. Her heart pounded, the world narrowing to the figure before her. He had changed. His jawline was sharper, his broad shoulders more defined. His hair was a shade darker, his stance carrying a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. But his eyes, those steel blue eyes, once filled with warmth, now held something guarded, a memory, a past, a love that had been stolen from them. Elizabeth felt the room fade into a hum. The noise, the people, the dinner, all of it blurred. Daniel Harris wasn't just a memory anymore. He was here. And suddenly, everything, the wedding, the expectations, the fate that had been decided for her, felt like a weight crushing her chest. Elizabeth sat frozen at the grand banquet table, her grip tightening around the stem of her wine glass. The sound of applause echoed through the ballroom, but it felt distant, like a muffled hum in the background of a dream or a nightmare. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, each thump rattling through her chest as if trying to break free. Daniel. The name alone sent a wave of heat and cold washing over her body. It had been years since she had seen him, years since he had disappeared without a word, years since she had forced herself to stop wondering why. Yet, here he was, standing just behind Amelia, on the stage, his expression unreadable, his presence undeniable. His steel blue eyes met hers across the crowded room, and for a fleeting second, the world fell away. It was just them, just like it had been all those years ago, in a time that now felt like it belonged to someone else. The weight of memories threatened to suffocate her, the echoes of whispered promises, stolen moments, and shattered dreams all crashing back at once. Then, just as quickly, the spell broke. The applause faded, replaced by the murmur of conversation as Amelia took the microphone, her voice warm and practiced. "I have known Elizabeth for years, since our college days, and I've had the privilege of watching her grow into the remarkable woman she is today. Elizabeth barely heard the words. Her focus remained locked on Daniel, her mind racing through 1,000 questions, each one colliding with the next. What was he doing here? Why now, after all this time? Had he known she would be here? She forced herself to look away, her fingers trembling slightly as she placed her glass down on the table. Michael, ever the attentive fiancé, leaned in slightly, his hand resting on hers. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low and smooth, a stark contrast to the chaos inside her. Elizabeth nodded automatically. "Just a little tired." Michael smiled, oblivious. "We still have the bridesmaid and groomsmen introductions coming up. Try to keep up." His tone was light, teasing, but Elizabeth barely registered it. Keep up. How could she? How could she pretend everything was fine when the past she had spent so long burying had just walked back into her life? The rest of the speeches passed in a blur. Amelia's words, the polite laughter from the crowd, even Michael's perfectly timed toast. It all felt like a distant murmur, like she was underwater, watching a world she no longer belonged to. When the formalities ended, guests began mingling, champagne glasses clinking as deals were made and connections solidified. The perfect environment for the elite, the powerful, the ones who controlled the world with a handshake and a well-placed smile. Elizabeth stood, excusing herself under the pretense of needing fresh air. She weaved through the crowd, her movements automatic, her mind elsewhere. The grand doors leading to the restaurant's balcony loomed ahead, and without hesitation she pushed them open and stepped outside. The crisp night air hit her skin, a stark contrast to the warmth inside. The city stretched before her, its lights flickering like stars scattered across the skyline. She inhaled deeply, trying to steady herself. She wasn't sure how long she stood there before she heard the footsteps behind her. She knew who it was before she turned around. Daniel. She felt his presence before she saw him. It was something unspoken, something that had never left her, even after all this time. When she finally turned, he was there, standing just a few feet away, his posture relaxed but his eyes intensely focused on her. Up close, the changes in him were even more apparent. He was older, more refined, but there was something deeper in his gaze now, something worn, something hardened by time and experience. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. What could she even say? The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. It was Daniel who broke it first. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said, his voice low, edged with something unreadable. Elizabeth swallowed, her throat dry. "Neither did I." Another silence, this one sharper, filled with the weight of things left unsaid. Daniel exhaled, looking away briefly before returning his gaze to hers. "Vanessa and I were close in college. When she asked me to be a groomsman, I didn't think I'd be seeing you like this. Like this. Engaged, about to be married, to someone else." Elizabeth's fingers curled against the railing. "Really?" she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Because I remember you never even saying goodbye." Daniel's expression tightened, a flicker of something crossing his face. He didn't answer right away. "I didn't think you'd want an explanation," he said finally. Elizabeth let out a soft, humorless laugh. "You don't get to decide that." She hadn't expected the sharp edge in her own voice, but she didn't regret it. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair. "It wasn't my choice." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. She shook her head. "What does that mean?" Daniel hesitated. He looked down at the city lights for a moment before finally meeting her gaze again. "Your future mother-in-law," he said. "She came to see me." Elizabeth's breath hitched. "What?" "She told me you had a future," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. "A future I didn't belong in. She made it clear that if I stayed in your life, I would be ruining everything you worked for." Elizabeth felt the world tilt slightly. She paid you off?" Daniel shook his head. "No, she offered, but I didn't take it." Her chest tightened. "Then why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Daniel's gaze softened, something raw flickering in his eyes. "Because she was right." Elizabeth's heart pounded. "What?" Daniel exhaled. "I wasn't good enough for you, Liz. Not back then. I had nothing to offer you. No stability, no future that matched what you deserved. And I thought leaving was the best thing I could do for you." She felt something inside her crack. All these years she had believed he had left because he wanted to, because he had chosen to. But the truth was worse. He had left because he thought it was the only way to give her the life she deserved. Her hands gripped the railing, her knuckles turning white. "My whole life," she whispered, more to herself than to him, "I've fought for my place in this world. And now you're telling me that the person I loved the most left me because he thought I couldn't make my own decisions?" Daniel didn't look away. "I thought I was protecting you." Elizabeth let out a shaky breath. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know what to feel. Anger? Sadness? Relief that she finally had an answer? Or fear? Fear that now that the truth was out, she had no idea what to do with it. Because in less than a week, she was supposed to marry Michael Bancroft. And suddenly, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. Elizabeth stood motionless on the balcony, the weight of Daniel's words pressing down on her like a force she couldn't shake. The city stretched before her, vast and illuminated, but the millions of lights did nothing to lessen the suffocating darkness curling in her chest. Her breath came in shallow, uneven pulls, her hands gripping the railing as if letting go would send her plummeting into the abyss of everything she had just learned. She had spent years convincing herself that Daniel had left because he had wanted to, that he had chosen to walk away from her, to abandon the life they had dreamed of together. She had forced herself to believe it, to accept it, because believing otherwise, believing that she had never truly understood the man she had loved, was unbearable. But now the truth had shattered that carefully constructed illusion. He hadn't left because he stopped loving her. He had left because he thought he was doing the right thing. She turned to look at him, his face bathed in the soft golden glow of the city. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his posture calm, but she knew him too well. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers curled slightly, as if resisting the urge to reach for her. He was waiting for her to say something, to react. But what could she possibly say to make sense of the years lost between them? "Why didn't you tell me?" Her voice was quieter than she intended, almost a whisper against the wind. Daniel exhaled slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Would it have changed anything? The question stung more than she expected. Would it? If he had told her the truth back then, would she have fought for them? Would she have turned her back on the path she had chosen, the path that had led her here, to this moment, standing on a balcony in a dress that wasn't hers, beside a man she was about to marry but didn't love? She wanted to say yes. She wanted to believe that she would have held on to him, that she would have told her future mother-in-law to keep her money, to keep her judgments, to keep her carefully constructed world of power and control. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had let him go. Maybe not willingly, maybe not knowingly, but she had let him go all the same. The past could not be undone. "I don't know," she admitted finally, her voice hollow. Daniel's expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes softened. "Neither do I." The silence between them stretched, filled with 1,000 unspoken things. The wind lifted the loose tendrils of her hair, cool against her heated skin. She needed to leave. She needed to get away from him before she did something reckless, something irreversible. But her legs refused to move. The sound of the balcony doors opening behind them snapped the moment in half. Elizabeth turned just in time to see Michael step outside, his expression easy, relaxed, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. "There you are," he said, stepping forward. "I was starting to think you'd vanished." Elizabeth forced a smile, but it felt like a lie even as it formed on her lips. "Just needed some air." Michael's gaze flicked to Daniel, his smile tightening ever so slightly. "Ah, I see you've met Daniel." Daniel nodded, his face a mask of polite indifference. "We were just catching up." Michael's arm slid around Elizabeth's waist, a possessive gesture so subtle that it could have been mistaken for affection. She felt the pressure of his hand against her lower back, grounding her, reminding her where she was, who she was supposed to be. "Well," Michael said, his voice smooth, "don't let us keep you. I'm sure you have plenty of other guests to mingle with." It wasn't a request, it was a dismissal. Elizabeth felt the shift in the air, the quiet understanding that passed between the two men. Daniel's expression didn't change, but there was something in the way his jaw tensed, the way his hands remained in his pockets as if he were restraining himself. She hesitated just for a moment. Then, because she had no other choice, she let Michael guide her back inside. The warmth of the ballroom hit her like a wave, suffocating after the crisp air of the balcony. The chandeliers sparkled above them, laughter and music filling the space like an illusion, a perfect, curated world where nothing was ever out of place. But everything inside her was out of place. Michael leaned in, pressing a brief kiss to her temple. "I'll take care of the guests. Take a moment if you need it." His words were gentle, but they were also permission. She knew what he meant. Compose yourself. Smile. Be perfect. She nodded, slipping away from him, her hands trembling at her sides. Her reflection caught her eye in the vast mirrors lining the walls. She looked flawless, elegant, poised. Every detail of her appearance was curated for this world, for this life. But when she looked into her own eyes, she barely recognized the woman staring back. That night, she barely slept. She lay in her bed, staring at the ceiling, the city lights casting long shadows across the walls. Michael was asleep beside her, his breathing even, undisturbed. He had no reason to doubt her. No reason to believe that she was lying awake, questioning everything. The truth sat heavy on her chest. She could still hear Daniel's voice. "Your future mother-in-law came to see me." Vanessa Bancroft, the woman who had orchestrated so much of her life. The woman who had always spoken about her with a thinly veiled condescension, as though Elizabeth were something to be polished, shaped into an acceptable version of herself. Had she truly believed she was helping Elizabeth? Or had she simply wanted to ensure that her son's future wife was free of any distractions, any attachments that didn't fit into the Bancroft legacy? Elizabeth didn't know what infuriated her more, the manipulation or the fact that she had never even questioned it. She turned her head slightly, watching Michael sleep. He looked peaceful, completely unaware of the war raging inside her. He had always been steady, reliable. Their relationship was built on logic, on compatibility, on the understanding that together they were stronger, that their union made sense. But love had never been a part of the equation. She had told herself for so long that love wasn't necessary, that stability mattered more, that emotion was unpredictable, fleeting, a luxury she couldn't afford in the world she had chosen to exist in. But if that were true, then why did she feel like she couldn't breathe? The answer was painfully clear. She had never truly chosen this life. It had been chosen for her. And now she had to decide before it was too late. The next morning, the weight of her realization settled into something more solid, something terrifying. She moved through the motions of the day, breakfast, meetings, final wedding preparations, with a strange sense of detachment, as though she were watching herself from the outside. By mid-afternoon, she found herself standing outside Vanessa Bancroft's townhome. She wasn't sure how she had gotten there. She only knew that she needed answers. When the butler let her in, Vanessa was already waiting in the grand sitting room, a glass of wine in hand, perfectly composed. She offered a knowing smile, as if she had expected this moment all along. Elizabeth sat down across from her, hands folded tightly in her lap. "You spoke to Daniel," she said. It wasn't a question. Vanessa took a slow sip of her wine before setting the glass down. "I did." Elizabeth's throat tightened. "You told him to leave." "I advised him," Vanessa corrected, her tone cool. "And he did what was best for you." Elizabeth's nails dug into her palms. "Best for me or best for you?" Vanessa didn't flinch. "There's no difference." Elizabeth felt something inside her fracture. There it was. The truth laid bare. Her entire life she'd been told that she was making choices, but they had never really been hers. And now, standing at the edge of a life she wasn't sure she wanted, she had to make the hardest choice of all. For the first time, she had to choose herself. Elizabeth left Vanessa Bancroft's town home with the echo of her words still ringing in her ears. The crisp autumn air should have cleared her mind, but the weight in her chest only grew heavier. She walked without direction, her heels clicking against the pavement, blending into the rhythm of the city's heartbeat. The world around her continued as if nothing had changed. Cars rushed past, pedestrians moved with purpose, conversations hummed through the air. But for her, nothing felt the same. There was no escaping the truth now. No more illusions, no more carefully constructed rationalizations. She had spent years believing she was in control of her life, that she had chosen her path, but it had never been a choice. Every step had been guided, every opportunity placed in front of her, leading her exactly where Vanessa Bancroft and people like her had wanted her to go. Her engagement, her career, even the absence of Daniel. A hollow laugh escaped her lips as she reached a quiet side street and leaned against the cool stone of a building. She had always prided herself on being strong, on carving her own way in a world that wasn't made for her, yet here she was, realizing she had been molded just the same as the art she created, shaped and refined until she fit perfectly into the space she had been assigned. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, willing her mind to settle, but the truth was relentless. Vanessa had taken Daniel from her. No, she corrected herself. Vanessa had removed the obstacle that Daniel represented. But she had let it happen. She had accepted it. She had believed the lies, moved forward, built the life that had been carefully crafted for her. She had done exactly what was expected of her. And now, standing on the edge of a future that felt more like a cage than a promise, she had to decide whether she would go through with it. The thought of returning to the life she had planned made her stomach tighten. Could she really stand at the altar in front of hundreds of people, with cameras capturing every perfect moment, and say the words that would bind her to Michael forever? Could she live the rest of her life knowing that her love, her real love, had been stolen from her? That she had let it happen? But what was the alternative? Walking away, throwing away everything she had built. If she left now, she would lose everything. Her status, her connections, the security that came with being part of the Bancroft empire. She would become an outcast, the woman who had thrown away perfection, the woman who had abandoned the life so many envied. And then there was Michael. She had never loved him, not in the way she had loved Daniel. But he had been good to her. He had been steady, reliable. He had never given her a reason to doubt him. Walking away from him wouldn't just be walking away from a wedding. It would be betraying the trust of a man who had never done anything to deserve it. She pressed her fingers against her temples, her head pounding. The choice before her was unbearable. But it had to be made. The apartment she shared with Michael was silent when she returned. He was still at a dinner meeting, one of the countless engagements that filled his meticulously planned schedule. Their home was pristine, a curated space designed to reflect success and refinement, yet it felt cold, impersonal. She walked to the large floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out over the city, watching the lights flicker like distant stars. She could still remember the nights she had spent in Daniel's small studio apartment, curled up in his arms as they talked about their dreams, their futures. His place had been cluttered, filled with sketches, books, and unfinished projects, but it had felt alive. Real. This place was beautiful, but it was empty. She crossed the room to the bedroom, her movements slow, deliberate. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over the screen. She scrolled through her contacts, stopping at Daniel's name. Her thumb hovered over it, her pulse quickening. She could call him. She could ask him to meet her, to talk, to help her make sense of the storm inside her. But would that change anything? Would it make her choice any easier? She set the phone down without calling. Some things had to be decided alone. The following morning, she sat across from Michael in their kitchen, their breakfast spread before them untouched. He was reading the news on his tablet, his expression as composed as ever. She watched him for a long moment, studying the man she was about to marry. "Michael," she said finally, her voice quiet. He looked up, his blue eyes sharp, attentive. "Yes?" She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. How could she tell him? How could she possibly explain what was tearing her apart? She faltered. "Are you happy?" He frowned slightly, setting down his tablet. "Of course. Why do you ask?" She forced a small smile. I've been thinking a lot, about everything. About us." Michael studied her carefully. "Elizabeth, if you're having doubts—" "I'm not," she interrupted quickly. The lie tasted bitter. "I just want to make sure that we're doing this for the right reasons." Michael's expression softened. He reached across the table, taking her hand in his. His grip was firm, reassuring. "Elizabeth, I love you. This is right. We're right. Everything we've built together, it's what we both want. We're a team. A team, not two people in love, not soulmates, a team." She nodded, pulling her hand away gently. "I just needed to hear that." He smiled, seemingly satisfied with her answer. "We're almost there. Just a few more days, and then everything will be perfect." Perfect. She swallowed the lump in her throat. That evening, She found herself outside Amelia's apartment. Her best friend had texted her earlier, asking if she wanted to talk, and she had said yes without thinking. Amelia opened the door before Elizabeth could even knock, pulling her inside with a knowing look. "You saw him." Elizabeth didn't pretend not to understand. "I did." Amelia sighed, leading her to the couch. "I knew this would happen the second I realized you two would be in the same room again." Elizabeth rubbed her hands over her face. "I don't know what to do, Amelia." Her friend exhaled. "Do you love Michael?" The question was direct, cutting through everything else. Elizabeth looked down. "I care about him." "That's not the same thing." "I know," she whispered. Amelia leaned forward. "Liz, you have spent so long trying to be the version of yourself that the world wanted. But what do you want?" Elizabeth's breath caught. "I don't know." "Then maybe it's time you figure that out before you say I do to a life that doesn't belong to you." Elizabeth closed her eyes, her heart pounding. She had spent so long ignoring that voice inside her, the one that had always whispered that something was missing. But she couldn't ignore it anymore. She had to decide. Not for Michael, not for Vanessa, not even for Daniel. For herself. And she was running out of time. The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of stillness that felt unnatural, like the air before a storm. The city was awake, moving, humming in its endless rhythm, but within the walls of the Bancroft estate, where preparations for the most anticipated event of the season were underway, there was an eerie quiet. Elizabeth sat at the vanity in her bridal suite, staring at her own reflection. The woman who gazed back at her was flawless, polished, refined, elegant in every way that was expected of her. The silk of the wedding gown cascaded around her like liquid ivory, the delicate beading catching the light with every breath she took. Her makeup was understated yet immaculate. Her hair gathered into an intricate updo with not a strand out of place. She looked like a bride out of a dream, but she didn't feel like one. Behind her, the room was a flurry of last-minute preparations. The stylists adjusted the hem of her dress, the planner whispered final details into a headset, the assistants moved with the urgency of people who knew their jobs depended on perfection. Everything was rehearsed, every detail orchestrated to create the illusion of an effortless fairy tale moment. Elizabeth remained silent through it all, her hands resting in her lap, her fingers curled inward as if bracing for impact. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her mind. She knew the steps, the script, the precise expression she was supposed to wear as she walked down the aisle. She had spent months preparing for this day. So why did she feel like she couldn't breathe? A soft knock at the door drew her attention, and a moment later, Vanessa Bancroft stepped inside. The matriarch of the family, regal in a deep sapphire dress, moved with the poise of a woman who had never once doubted her place in the world. Her expression was unreadable, but the sharpness in her gaze was unmistakable. The stylists and assistants instinctively stepped aside, sensing the weight of Vanessa's presence. She approached Elizabeth slowly, taking in the sight of her as if assessing a final masterpiece before it was unveiled to the world. "You look exquisite," she said after a long pause. Elizabeth met her gaze in the mirror but said nothing. Vanessa tilted her head slightly. "I assume you've had time to reflect on your doubts." A lump formed in Elizabeth's throat. She had never told Vanessa about her hesitation, had never voiced her inner turmoil aloud, but the woman saw everything. There was no point in pretending. "Yes," Elizabeth murmured. Vanessa's lips curved ever so slightly, a ghost of satisfaction flickering in her expression. "Good. A moment of uncertainty is natural. But this is your future, Elizabeth. A future that has been carefully built, not just for you, but for generations to come. You understand that, don't you?" The weight of her words settled over Elizabeth like chains, heavy and unrelenting. This was her final warning. A reminder that this was bigger than her, bigger than love, bigger than personal desires. This was duty, obligation, a role she had been chosen to fulfill. Elizabeth's fingers clenched against the smooth fabric of her gown. For so long, she had believed that walking away was impossible, that turning her back on this life would mean losing everything she had worked for. But as she sat there, suffocating in the perfection of a future that wasn't hers, she realized the truth. She had already lost herself. The knock that followed was brisk, impatient. A moment later, Michael stepped inside, disregarding the tradition that dictated he shouldn't see the bride before the ceremony. He looked composed, as always, but there was an edge to him, something taut beneath the surface. "Give us a moment," he said, his voice polite but firm. Vanessa hesitated, but after a brief pause, she inclined her head and left the room, her presence lingering like the scent of expensive perfume. When the door closed behind her, Michael turned to Elizabeth. His blue eyes searched her face, and for the first time in their entire relationship, she saw something almost like uncertainty in them. "You're going to go through with this," he said, but there was no question in his voice, only expectation. Elizabeth held his gaze, her pulse roaring in her ears. This was the moment where she could do what was expected, what was safe, what would secure everything she had built. Or she could tell the truth. "I can't," she said, the words escaping her lips before she could stop them. Michael's expression didn't change. Not immediately. He simply stared at her as if waiting for her to correct herself. "What did you say?" His voice was eerily calm. She swallowed hard, her hands tightening in her lap. "I can't marry you, Michael." A beat of silence stretched between them, heavy and unbearable. Then, slowly, he exhaled, his jaw tightening. He stepped closer, his movements precise, controlled. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice quieter now, more dangerous. "This isn't just about us. You understand that, don't you?" "I do," she whispered, "but that's exactly the problem." His fingers curled into fists at his sides. "So what are you going to do? Walk away? Humiliate yourself? Humiliate me?" She flinched at the sharp edge in his tone, at the first real glimpse of anger beneath his carefully maintained exterior. She had always known that their relationship was built on stability, on logic, but she had never seen what he would become when that stability was threatened. "I'm sorry," she said, and for the first time she truly meant it. Michael let out a sharp laugh devoid of humor. He ran a hand through his hair, his perfect composure cracking just slightly. Then, after a long, tense silence, he shook his head. "You have no idea what you're doing," he muttered. "No idea what you're throwing away." Maybe he was right, but for the first time in years she wasn't afraid. He let out a breath as if trying to rid himself of the frustration rolling off him in waves. When he spoke again, his voice was flat. "Then I hope whatever life you're choosing instead is worth it." Elizabeth didn't respond. She didn't need to. Michael straightened his jacket, collected himself, and without another word, turned and walked out the door. She didn't stay to hear the whispers. She didn't wait to see the fallout. By the time the guests realized what had happened, by the time the whispers turned to scandal, by the time Vanessa Bancroft's carefully crafted empire felt the first tremors of what she would undoubtedly call betrayal, Elizabeth was already gone. She walked out of the estate and into the waiting streets of New York, her heart pounding, but her chest feeling lighter than it had in years. The weight that had once chained her to a life that wasn't hers had finally fallen away. She didn't know what would come next. She had no plan, no carefully constructed future to fall into. But as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the city unfolding before her in a blur of lights and movement, she realized something. For the first time in her life, she was free. And freedom, no matter how terrifying, was worth everything. Elizabeth walked the streets of New York with no clear direction, the echoes of her last conversation with Michael still reverberating in her mind. The city, ever indifferent, moved around her. Cars honked, people hurried past, conversations blended into an indistinct hum, but she felt as though she existed in a space separate from it all. It was as if she had stepped outside of her own life and into something unfamiliar, something raw and unfiltered. She had done it. She had walked away. She had spent so long believing that leaving was impossible, that the life she had built, the security she had fought for, was too deeply woven into her identity to be abandoned. But as she moved through the streets, the weight she had carried for so many years, expectations, obligations, the suffocating pressure to be perfect, had lifted. It wasn't gone entirely. Not yet. But for the first time she felt as though she could breathe. And yet, the uncertainty was suffocating in its own way. She had left behind everything. The certainty of a future, the stability of a carefully planned life. She had no home to go back to, no career untouched by the Bancrofts' influence, no clear idea of what came next. For the first time in years, there was no script, no path laid out for her to follow. She had chosen herself. But now she had to figure out who that self truly was. Her feet carried her toward a part of the city she hadn't visited in years. The streets became narrower, the buildings older, the energy different. She hadn't meant to come here, but as she turned a familiar corner and saw the small art studio tucked between a bookstore and a cafe, she knew it wasn't a coincidence. Daniel's studio. She hesitated on the sidewalk, her pulse quickening. The last time she had seen him, she had been standing on a balcony, unraveling the truth of the past, the weight of his absence pressing down on her like an anchor. She had walked away that night, not because she didn't want answers, but because she hadn't been ready for them. Now she wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she couldn't run anymore. The door was slightly ajar, the light inside spilling onto the pavement. She stepped forward, pushing it open, and was immediately hit by the scent of paint and sawdust, the familiar chaos of a space where creativity lived. The walls were lined with unfinished canvases, sketches pinned haphazardly, shelves stacked with books and tools. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the life she had just left behind, and yet it felt more like home than anywhere she had been in years. Daniel was at the far end of the room, his back to her, lost in his work. He was bent over a canvas, his fingers smudged with charcoal, the sleeves of his shirt rolled up to his elbows. For a moment, she simply watched him, taken in the sight of him in his element, the quiet intensity that had always drawn her to him still present in every movement. Then he turned. Their eyes met, and the space between them became charged with everything left unsaid. He didn't speak right away. Neither did she. There was no need for rushed explanations, no demand for immediate answers. They had spent too long running, too long avoiding this moment. Now, all that remained was the quiet understanding that something had shifted. "You left," he said finally, his voice even. She nodded, I did. There was no judgment in his gaze, only quiet curiosity, as if he were waiting for her to tell him why. She stepped further into the room, her fingers trailing over the edge of a nearby table. I thought I knew what I wanted, she admitted. I thought security mattered more than anything else. That if I could just build a life that looked perfect, it wouldn't matter if it felt empty. Daniel watched her, his expression unreadable. And now? She exhaled slowly. Now, I don't know anything at all. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips, but there was no amusement in it. That's a good place to start. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. I don't know what I'm doing, Daniel. You're figuring it out, he said simply. She looked around the studio, the unfinished pieces scattered across the room. Are you? His gaze flickered to the paintings, the half-formed ideas still waiting for completion. Every day. She nodded, understanding more than she expected to. There was no sudden revelation, no instant clarity about what came next. But there was something about standing here, in this space, in front of him, that felt like the first step towards something real. She didn't ask him if he had been waiting for her. She didn't ask him what he had thought when he saw the news of her wedding collapse in the headlines. Those questions didn't matter. What mattered was that she had chosen to be here, now, in this moment. She glanced at the charcoal in his hand. Are you going to finish that? She asked, nodding toward the canvas. He studied her for a moment, then held out the piece of charcoal. An invitation. She hesitated only for a second before stepping forward and taking it from him, the rough texture familiar against her fingers. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to draw, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't need to know. She simply needed to begin. The days that followed were unlike anything Elizabeth had ever known. She woke up in an apartment that wasn't hers, in a life that no longer had a blueprint. The meticulously curated existence she had spent years crafting had unraveled in a single moment, leaving her standing at the edge of something uncharted. The first morning after the wedding that never was, she awoke in a small loft apartment that Daniel had offered her for the time being. It wasn't his own. He had found it through a friend, knowing she had nowhere to go. It was nothing like the sleek, soulless penthouse she had shared with Michael. The floors creaked under her feet. The windows let in the sound of the city instead of shutting it out, and the walls were bare, waiting to be filled. She stood by the window, watching the world below, the city moving on as if nothing had changed. Except, for her, everything had. She had turned on her phone once that morning. The screen had exploded with unread messages, missed calls from her mother, from old friends, from people who had never cared before, but now had something to say. The news had spread faster than she could have imagined. The wedding of the year, the perfect engagement, the union that was supposed to solidify her place in society, had collapsed in front of hundreds of witnesses. She hadn't read the headlines, but she didn't need to. She could already hear the whispers. She turned the phone off again. She spent the rest of that day wandering the streets, breathing in a city that felt both familiar and foreign. Without a plan, without a schedule, without a role to play, she was simply Elizabeth. No last name, no expectations, just a woman trying to remember who she had been before she had let the world decide for her. She found herself in places she hadn't visited in years. The old bookstore where she had spent hours in college, running her fingers along the spines of novels she swore she would read one day, but never did. The cafe with the mismatched chairs and uneven floors where she had once sat with Daniel, scribbling sketches on napkins as they talked about the future they had imagined. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, only that she had to keep moving. When night fell, she returned to the studio. Daniel was there, as she knew he would be. He was bent over a canvas, the dim lighting casting shadows along the sharp angles of his face. He looked up when she entered, but he didn't ask where she had been. She sat down beside him, pulling her knees to her chest. He didn't fill the silence with meaningless words, didn't ask her if she was okay, because they both knew she wasn't. Instead, he handed her a brush. "Paint," he said simply. And she did. For the first time in years, she let the movements come without overthinking, without worrying about perfection. She let the brushstroke guide her, let the colors blend and bleed together, let the emotions she had buried for so long spill onto the canvas. She didn't know how long they sat there, side by side, lost in their own worlds, but connected in the quiet understanding that neither of them had to be alone in this. The days passed like this, slowly, uncertainly, but without the weight that had once pressed on her every step. She started looking for work. It was strange, trying to find a job without the name Bancroft attached to her resume. She had spent so long in spaces where influence mattered more than talent that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to prove herself without a name behind her. The rejection came swiftly at first. Some places hesitated when they recognized her, too caught up in the scandal that followed her name now. Others didn't care at all, uninterested in an artist whose work had been displayed in galleries she no longer had access to. But then, one day, she found a place that didn't ask about her past. It was a community art center in a forgotten corner of the city, a space that had been created not for the elite, but for those who had nowhere else to go. The walls were covered in murals painted by hands that had never been formally trained, but the stories they told were more vivid than anything she had seen in the pristine galleries she had once called home. She walked in, not sure what she expected, and was greeted by a woman named Rosa, who barely looked up from her paperwork as she asked, "What can you do?" "I can teach," Elizabeth said. Rosa had studied her for a long moment, then nodded, then teach. And just like that, she had a job. It wasn't glamorous. There were no champagne receptions, no carefully curated exhibitions. She worked with kids who painted with their hands, teenagers who had been told their art would never matter, adults who had once dreamed of creating but had given it up when life had become too heavy. For the first time in years, she felt like she was doing something real. Daniel visited sometimes. He never stayed long, never interfered, but she saw the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. She wondered what he saw, if he recognized her now, or if he was still looking for the girl she had been before she had become someone else. One evening, after the last student had left, she found him sitting on the floor by the mural wall, sketching in a notebook. She sat down beside him, pulling her legs beneath her. "Are you happy?" he asked, his voice quiet. She thought about it. About the uncertainty, about the fear, about the fact that she had no idea what the future looked like anymore. "I think I'm getting there," she said. Daniel nodded, his gaze still on his sketchbook. "Good." The silence between them was comfortable. She didn't know what they were now. Friends? Something more? Something unfinished? Maybe it didn't matter yet. For now, she was learning how to exist in a world that wasn't scripted. And, for the first time, that was enough. A year had passed, though sometimes it felt like a lifetime. Other times, it felt like no time at all. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the community garden, the place she had spent months designing, her gaze traveling over the softly glowing lights strung above her. The space had transformed from an abandoned lot into something alive, something filled with color and purpose. It was more than just an art space now. It had become a haven, a refuge for those who had never been given a place to create. She ran her fingers along the rough wooden table in the center, tracing the carved initials and painted names of the people who had made this place theirs. She had poured everything she had into this project, into this new life she had built from nothing. There had been days of exhaustion, of frustration, of wondering if she had made the right decision. But there had also been moments like this, moments where she could see the tangible proof that she had chosen something real. The laughter of children echoed from across the garden where a group was finishing a mural, their hands covered in paint. Their work was imperfect, wild, unpolished, but it was theirs. She had spent so much of her old life chasing perfection, believing that art had to be curated, that it had to fit within the constraints of a gallery or a collector's demands. Here, there were no constraints. Here, everything was as it was meant to be. She felt a presence before she heard his voice. "You really did it," Daniel said. She turned, finding him leaning against the fence, his arms crossed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. He looked different now, lighter, though she wasn't sure if that was because of time or because they had both finally learned how to breathe. She smiled. "I did." He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping across the space. "They needed this. You needed this." She nodded. "I didn't know if I could do it. Not at first." "But you did," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the way he fit so naturally into this world, the way he had always belonged here in a way she hadn't. Or maybe she had just forgotten that she had belonged too. For months, he had been a constant presence in her life, though never in the way people had expected. He hadn't tried to fix her, hadn't tried to make decisions for her. He had simply been there, watching, waiting, letting her find her own way. And now, she realized, she was no longer lost. "You never asked me why I left," she said. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "I didn't need to." She let out a soft breath. "Why not?" "Because I knew you would figure it out on your own," he said. There was no accusation in his voice, no bitterness, only understanding. She looked down at her hands, at the smudges of paint on her skin. "I used to think that if I left that life, I'd be giving up everything I worked for, that I'd be throwing away all the years I spent proving myself. And now?" She looked up at him. "Now I know that I wasn't proving myself to the world. I was proving myself to people who never really saw me." He didn't respond right away, but she saw the way his shoulders relaxed, the way something settled between them. For a long time, she had wondered what would happen if she and Daniel ever found their way back to each other. She had spent nights tracing the what-ifs in her mind, wondering if the years apart had created too much distance, if they had become too different. But now, standing here, she realized the answer had never been about them. It had been about her. She had needed to learn who she was outside of expectation, outside of Daniel, outside of everything that had once defined her, and she had. A hush fell over the garden as the evening grew darker, the sky shifting to deep indigo, the string lights above casting a warm glow over the space. She turned to find Daniel watching her, something unreadable in his expression. She had seen that look before. It was the way he had looked at her years ago, in the quiet moments when neither of them had to say anything at all. But this time, it was different. This time, she knew herself. Daniel reached into his pocket, hesitating for only a moment before pulling out a small velvet box. He turned it over in his hand before looking back at her. "I once stood in front of hundreds of people," he said, his voice quiet, steady, "watching you marry someone else." She felt her breath catch. "I didn't stop you then, because it wasn't my place," he continued, "because you had to make your own choice." He held up the box, but he didn't open it. "This time, I want to do it right," he said. Elizabeth stared at him, her heart pounding, not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't. "Daniel, you don't have to answer now," he said gently. "You don't have to answer at all. This isn't about me or about the past. This is about you, about what you want, about whether this life you've built for yourself still has room for me in it." She swallowed hard, emotion rising in her chest. No grand declarations, no demands, just a choice. Her choice. She reached out, placing her fingers over the box, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath hers. She could say no. She could walk away. She could choose a life that didn't include him, and she knew, deep in her heart, that he would let her. But she didn't want to. Not because she was afraid of being alone. Not because she was searching for something to complete her, but because she wanted him, on her own terms, in her own time. She closed her fingers around the box, lifting it from his hand, and finally she smiled. "I think," she said softly, "that I'm ready to answer now." And for the first time in her life, she knew, whatever happened next, she had chosen it. Herself. Truly. Don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video or explore others you might enjoy. And if you like this one, share it with someone who would too.